Showtime. Okay. Showtime.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us to the Boerne Book and Arts Festival 2020. And this year is virtual. We hope to be back on Main Plaza next year. This panel is Strong Women, writing about strong women. We have three very strong women writers that I'll introduce in just a few minutes. But I wanted to make sure, I'm sure everybody's going to want to purchase all of their books after this program, after this fabulous program. If you haven't already purchased them, you can purchase them through our website, boernebookfest.com. And the authors have all been very gracious to sign book plates for us in advance of this. So if you purchase the books through us, you'll get a signed book plate so you can have an autographed book. If you don't see your favorite book by your favorite author on the website, just email me and I will do my best to get the book for you. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first author, Judy Alter, and then she's going to talk about her featured book for this program. After an award-winning career writing historical fiction about women of the 19th century American West, Judy Alter turned her attention to contemporary cozy mysteries. Several of her Kelly O'Connell mysteries and Blue Plate Cafe mysteries were published by Turquoise Morning Press and are still available. When her publisher went out of business, she became an indie publisher and barely looked back. Judy is an active member of Sisters in Crime, Guppy's Story Circle Network, Women Writing the West, and the Texas Institute of Letters. When she is not writing, she is busy with 7 grandchildren and a lively poodle border collie cross. Her avocation is cooking, and she is the author of Cooking My Way Through Life with Kids and Books, Gourmet on a Hot Plate, and Texas is a Chili Country. Born in Chicago, she has made her home in Fort Worth for over 50 years. Judy is also a proud Scot and a member of Clan MacBean. One trip to the Highlands convinced her that it's where her heart is and where she longs to write a novel set in Scotland. So today, Judy is featured for her wonderful book, The Second Battle of the Alamo. And could you talk to us a little bit about that book, Judy?
Well, I can, and of course it's not a cozy mystery, but I need to give credit where credit is due. I inherited that project from Deborah Weingarten, who some of you may know. Deborah was a friend of mine in a small online writing circle, and I knew she had a contract with Two Dot Books to write this. And I kind of encouraged her because it was the kind of topic I liked. I was kind of sorry it didn't land in my lap instead of hers, but she went out and got it, and I was encouraging her. She suffered some health problems, and in July of 2018, she was diagnosed with overwhelming metastatic cancer. And she called me from her hospital room and said, "Would you write my book?" And so, of course, I wrote her book. And her partner brought me 2 cartons of a hot mess of papers, just thrown in any which way. Took me months to make sense of it, and 1 carton of books. And I dug in. I had to start kind of all over again to make it my book. But it is the story of the Second Battle of the Alamo, in which 2 women, Adina de Zavala and Clara Driscoll, saved the Alamo from destruction. It was in downtown San Antonio. Businessmen wanted that property. It was being crowded out. Somebody had their eye on it for a hotel or a hotel parking lot. And the 2 women got together the money. Clara had the money. Adina had the drive and the dedication to preservation, which in the first decade of the 20th century was not the subject that it is today. She was a pioneer in that. Anyway, it's the story of how they fought to save it. And they really did change the course of Texas history, at least the course of the way we talk about it and think about it.
Thank you. Okay, next up is Sarah Burt, and I'm going to pull your bio here. So Sarah Bird is the author of Daughter of a Queen, her last novel. It was a finalist for the Dublin Literary Award. Sarah is an 8-time winner of Austin Best Fiction Writer Award, winner of the 2020 Paul Ray Award for Cultural Advocacy, a 2015 selection for Meryl Streep Screenwriters Lab, and was selected to be the hologram greeter for the Austin Downtown Library in honor of her work for libraries and literacy. And you can actually, I think, go to the Austin Library website to see that, right? The hologram? I think so. Sarah is also an Amazon Literature Best of the Year selection, a 2-time winner of the TIL's Best Novel Award, and TIL is Texas Institute of Letters. Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Selection, New York Public Library's Books to Remember, and a member of the Texas Writers Hall of Fame. She is a contributing writer to Texas Monthly and worked as a screenwriter for 10 years with Warner Brothers, Paramount, National Geographic, Spring Creek Productions, ABC, Hallmark, CBS, TNT, and various independent producers. So thank you so much for joining us, Sarah. And could you talk to us about Daughter of a Queen?
Yeah, I'd love to, Karen, and thank you so much for inviting me. This is exciting. I'm quite thrilled. I wore this special T-shirt. A woman's place is everywhere. So Daughter of a Queen is a novel based on the true story of Kathy Williams, who is the only woman that we know who served with the legendary Buffalo Soldiers. And I first heard her story. I'm going to try to give a condensed version of this, and it comes with pictures. But I first heard her story over 40 years ago. And at that time, I was photographing. There it is. I had just graduated from UT, and I had a photojournalism degree. And I was just entranced with all the strange and wonderful parts of Texas culture, and in particular rodeo, not mainstream rodeo, but the offshoots of Texas, of regular mainstream rodeo, in which every community refashioned this most American of sports and made it their own. And so I photographed kids rodeos and women's rodeos and chadeadas, gay rodeos. Anyway, but the ones I really loved the most were the African American rodeos. And in 1978, I was photographing this rodeo and interviewing these 2 handsome cowboys in the Diamond L Arena on South Main. It used to be a legendary venue for cowboys and cowgirls of color on South Main, the Diamond L, and it's no longer there. But they were having a Juneteenth rodeo. And these were the most jubilant, joyous community affairs. And I found the cowboys in the photograph and started interviewing them. And they had unbelievable histories. They had worked at the 4-6 ranches and the Shanghai Pierce Ranch. And, you have to keep in mind at this time, 1978, I was bringing these photographs back and sharing them with my photo friends and in various places. And people were surprised to learn there had been Black cowboys. There still were Black cowboys. I mean, that was where we were in 1978. So these gentlemen talked to me a lot about their lives. And then they said, who you should write a story about? And I said, yeah, please. And they said, Kathy Williams. She served in the Buffalo Soldiers. And I said, how is that possible? It was a peacetime. She's the first known woman to serve in peacetime U.S. military, because there were hundreds, maybe thousands of women who passed during both the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, but peacetime is a whole other degree of difficulty. And so this story just fascinated me. I think one of the main reasons was because, talk about strong women. My mother was there she is. This is my mother outside her tent in Tunisia. And she was an army nurse, followed the troops throughout North Africa and into Italy, and so and my father was, I mean, I was a military kid. So this world always fascinated me, and the thought of a woman being part of it, I just couldn't let it go. That was 40 years ago, and I'm not going to, trace the entire 40-year evolution, my journey with Kathy, but it took a long time, and there are lots of chapters in this story, but that's when I first heard the story, and there's so little documentation about the Buffalo Soldiers in general because, as you know, virtually all the recruits were illiterate because had been illegal for the enslaved people to learn how to read or write. So they were not able to, create their own mythology in the way, our known Western heroes had. So I took what is known about Kathy and that she enlisted. She served with Sheridan's throughout the Civil War. She enlisted and she served for 2 years. And there's a few interviews and whatnot. But I took this as the basis for the novel and created, with a ton of research and, reading books like 40 miles a day on beans and hay. I created this story, which is a tribute to her magnificent decision.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. Okay, and next over to Elizabeth Wetmore. Thank you for joining us. Before devoting herself to writing, Elizabeth variously tended bar, taught English, drove a cab, edited psychology dissertations, and painted silos and cooling towers at a petrochemical plant. For a time, she lived in a one-room cabin in the woods outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, while she worked as a classical musical announcer. A native of West Texas, she is most at home in the desert, near the sea, or on the side of a mountain. She lives in Chicago, but she dreams of being bi-coastal, think Lake Michigan and Lake Travis. She is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and is the recipient of a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts and 2 fellowships from the Illinois Arts Council, as well as a grant from the Barbara Deming Foundation. In addition, she has a Rona Jaffe Scholar in Fiction at Breadloaf and a fellow at the MacDowell Connolly. In spring of 2015, she was one of 6 writers in residence at Hedgebrook. Valentine, which is set in West Texas, is her novel that we're featuring today. And could you please tell us about that?
Hi, thank you. I'm incredibly honored to be here. A little overwhelmed actually to be here. So thank you. It's a pleasure. As Karen said, Valentine is set in 1976 in Odessa. Probably most of you know Odessa, but for those of you who don't know Texas or aren't from Texas, Odessa is a smallish city at the southern end of the Llano Estacado. It's geographically remote and full of oil. It's a vast oil-rich region known as the Permian Basin. There's and by most measures, it's just as homely as an old mutt. Most people, one of the sort of Texas locals jokes is, why did God give oil to West Texas to make up for what he did to the land? But I love it out there. I love the land out there. And maybe because I've lived in cities for most of my time since I left Texas, I've really come to treasure unpeopled places, places where you can get in your car and drive and disappear. I miss the sound of the wind, and I miss road runners and rattlesnakes, even those, and sunsets that are so beautiful they make your heart hurt. So falling in love with the land was my sort of entry into falling in love with the town and falling back in love with the women that I knew growing up, who lived and worked and raised their children there. Although it had a different title, several actually, Valentine began as a story about a young woman, a wife and a mother, who has to contend with an injured stranger who comes to her door asking for help. And I imagined it as a short story. And as a short story, I hope that it would be like the best of short stories, contained and devastating and, perfect. And so in those early drafts, you know, her voice, Mary Rose Whitehead's voice, was really clear to me. You know, I'd spent my entire childhood eavesdropping on my mom and her girlfriends and the ladies in the neighborhood, you know, when they sat out on the back porch after supper with cigarettes and Bloody Marys. It was the 70s, everyone smoked. And I listened to them, you know, rehashing their days and bitching about their husbands and their children and the price of oil. You know, I was born and raised in Odessa. So, you know, during the course of my childhood, I heard them talk about the price of oil in terms of everyone getting a job, you know, being able to maybe sock a little money away to send a kid to college. And an oil bust, I listened to them talk about, you know, who was leaving town, you know, who had lost their homes, who had lost their jobs. So when I began this book, I thought I knew their voices so well, you know, that they were so familiar to me. And I expected this to be a pretty quick project, actually. And what I learned in very short order was that even though I'd been listening to these voices my whole life, I didn't know these women at all, you know, or certainly not in any complicated way, not in the sort of complicated way that would warrant, you know, a book, you know, and I didn't see them clearly at all. So I set out to learn about the place I was from and the people that I knew growing up there. And 14 years later, give or take, 14 years later, I have Valentine. And that's somewhat misleading. I didn't work on Valentine every day. For many years, I you know, worked on it at the sort of edges of my life after work and between raising my son. And I stepped away for long periods of time, sometimes for practical reasons, sometimes because I lost my nerve. It was incredibly important to me to get it right, you know, and I felt very strongly from the beginning that I wanted so badly for these women's voices to make it into my book and to be the voices that they deserve to have, the stories that they deserve to have. Anyway, so that's Valentine. A few years ago, in a really sort of bleak period of my writing life, I came across these words from Don DeLillo, and I wrote them on a 3x5 note card, and I taped it above my desk. He wrote, "Do you know why I believe in the novel? It's a democratic shout. Anybody can write a great novel, one great novel. Almost any amateur off the street, some nameless drudge, some desperado with barely a nurtured dream can sit down and find his voice and luck out and do it. Something so angelic, it makes your jaw drop." And of course, I don't think of my book as a great novel. I've never thought of it that way. I know Valentine is deeply flawed, but those words gave me a lot of comfort. And I took another, and in spite of its flaws, I took a little comfort from some words of Leonard Cohen, that there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets on. And so I've grown over the years to even see the flaws in the book as beautiful. And for me, that meant seeing the flaws in these characters as beautiful as well. So that's the book. I'll stop. So I wanted to tell the stories with a sense of urgency, you know, a sense that the story couldn't wait another minute, that it mattered, that the lives of these women and girls mattered, and that they still do. So,
Boy, you nailed it, Beth. That is a transporting book, transcendently beautiful book.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. So I will ask a few questions, but if anybody in our audience would like to ask questions of our panelists, feel free to do so with the Q&A or the chat, and we'll field those questions. One question, Judy, I wanted to ask about your book and reading it, The Second Battle of the Alamo. The voices of Clara Driscoll and Adina de Zavala are just really wonderful in your book. And you decided to use their voices in kind of a creative nonfiction. I was wondering if you could expand on that.
That was the idea of the editor.
Oh, okay.
I wrote the first draft of the whole story, and it was something like a big 12,000 words. So I knew I had to do something, and she kept saying to me, use your storytelling skills, use the skills that you have used in fiction. So I did what I know my historian colleagues would despair over. I inserted imagined dialogue. Deborah had done some rough draft work, and she had done that. So, but her style wasn't my style, but I still picked up from that and played on it. So it is a kind of a mix of fiction and nonfiction.
I think it works really well.
Well, thank you, because I was a little, having been in publishing, I was self-conscious about it because I've turned down a lot of nonfiction manuscripts that dribbled over into fiction. And I've said, no, you can't do that.
Oh.
So I was doing it. But the editor seemed to like it because she's given me a contract for another book.
Oh, well, great. Yeah. And then to expand on that, can you tell us a little bit about other projects that you've done and are working on?
Well, I just had a mystery come out week before last called Saving Irene. And it's set in Chicago, Beth, in the neighborhood I grew up in. And it's a culinary mystery about a TV chef and her assistant, her gopher. And I have lots of fun doing the mysteries. But I do have to say that writing about women of the American West, mostly 19th century, but not all, Texas and the West in general, is where my heart lies. It's where I grew up and what I'd rather do. I just kind of do the mysteries to keep busy in between.
Okay, I have a question that came in for Beth from Dara. Beth, I read your book about a year ago and couldn't put it down. I still remember each of the women so vividly. I found these women in books before. The moments of support they gave each other were so powerful. How did you get to know each of the women in the book so clearly?
Well, when you work on a book for 14 years, you spend a lot of time with your characters. And again, I began with, characters who were very, very loosely based on women and girls I knew growing up. For example, in 1976, I was about the same age as Deborah Ann Pierce. And then of course, as you take a book draft after draft after draft, right, it becomes more and more fictional all the time. And at some point your characters become their own thing and sort of take off running, but I guess I'd say I spent a lot of time with them and I loved them, I mean, even the worst of them or even the most flawed of them, I found, as time passed that I loved them more all the time. And I wanted to see them clearly, and I wanted to know them, One of the things that changed for me as I wrote the book was that I had my son, and so in really, really early drafts of the book, after I'd sort of written the short story that becomes the second chapter, Mary Rose's chapter, I had decided that Mary Rose's short story would be a part of other short stories, but the book would focus on the lives of the little girls who lived on Larkspur Lane in 1976, the little girls who coincidentally were my age, right? And so I had this vision of the book that I would focus on those little girls, Deborah Ann Pierce, Laura Lee Ledbetter, and then I had my son, and it changed everything for me. And suddenly the lives of those women on Larkspur Lane became so much more compelling to me. And as time passed, I felt like I understood their sorrow and their rage, and their longing to do well by their daughters in particular, and their sort of survival instincts, and the way that they managed to help each other, in a time and a place where, these particular characters, I think of all my characters, I think only Corinne Shepherd has gone to college. Most of these characters don't have a lot of money. They don't have a lot of overt power. So I was really interested in how they sort of, stand up for each other and themselves and their daughters, within the confines of where they are. So.
Thank you, Beth. And a question for Sarah. I've been reading your book and your love letter to Texas women. I would give anything to have had the opportunity to meet Molly Ivins even now. She looms so large in my imagination. Same with Barbara Jordan.
Yes.
I spend a lot of time wondering what some of the strongest women I've ever known would have to say about our present moment.
Amen, right? Amen. You know, I mean, not very many days go by until, I talk to a lady libtard of my age, and we look at each other and go, what would Molly say? What would Anne say? And they are so sui generis. Nobody has come after those women that are quite like them. And I think, their strength was formed in this Texas crucible, this kind of Southern woman thing, combined with that frontier woman strength. And what they both got, and I relate to it from growing up in a military family where, a girl's job was to be cute and be quiet, and I hit 5'10" when I was in fifth grade. So cute was out. But I also understood, at least in my family with my father, and apparently Anne and Molly had similar family situations, and I think not uncommon with Texas daddies, that, you pretty much couldn't say anything unless you could get a laugh. And if you could get a laugh, you could say the most outrageous stuff, and so I feel like, both of them were fine-tuned in this. And to watch them now, to go back, I was recently researching something. I watched Ann Richards. She was governor, and she was commenting during the Bush election. And, I remember Ross Perot was the spoiler in that election. And she was talking to, that suave Canadian dude. You know who I mean. Okay, suave Canadian dude. And he was kind of giving her this, well, I think all the pundits will agree that, who did Bush run against? Was he running against Clinton? Okay, anyway, the Dem does not have a chance. And Anne she got that, her face and she just like lasered him with those acetylene torch blue eyes and said, no, I don't think so, Peter. That's not going to happen. I wish I could do her accent. I mean, it's worth going back and see how, no female politician has managed what both of them managed, which was, kind of good old boy style, always with a tinge of humor, super, super smart. Anyway, I totally agree with you, Beth. Aunt Molly Ivins is the only hero I've ever had. And we could talk forever about those two women. And Anne, God, I wish, but you almost know what they would say because, of what they did say. So, Molly Ivins would say, keep on fighting, beloveds. We don't always win, but we have a better time. And, and how politicians, once they start dividing people, they use fear to divide. It's just, could come right out of today. And Ann Richards said, power is the name of the game, and white males control the game. But yeah, we know what they would say. We know exactly what they would say, but I wish they were here to say it.
I love that,
I want to show
Sarah.
you what's on my desk. It's
Absolutely, girl.
Molly Ivins, she did say that.
I love that, Sarah. I think to a lot of us, they probably would say, keep fighting, right? Hang on to your true north. I think to some of us, they might say the world's changed and it's not going back, so better.
Yes, they would understand. They would understand that. They would understand that.
Yeah.
And yeah. And Anne with her push to, fill the government with, faces that had never been in the state capitol before. And she understood. They both understood. So yeah, wish they were here.
Me too.
Thank you, Sarah. So we have a question for Judy. So Judy, specifically for their contributions regarding saving the Alamo, did you come to have, as a writer, greater affinity for Driscoll or De Zavala, and why?
De Zavala, definitely. Clara, was a bit of a diva. She had all the money in the world, and I don't think anybody ever told that woman no, except Adina. They started as colleagues and they ended up as bitter enemies, which is really sad. But Adina had the historical knowledge and the persistence. Clara wanted to make a shrine out of the chapel and tear down the Long Barracks. And Adina wouldn't stand for it because the Long Barracks is where the fighting actually took place. So I don't know, and I talked to the editor about it and I said, I find myself liking Adina a lot more. And she said, yeah, me too. So I'm grateful to Clara, and she had an interesting life. That was the only preservation project she ever undertook. Adina devoted her whole life to historic preservation. And among other things, she restored the governor's palace in San Antonio. So I don't know, she was my favorite.
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to talk to us a little bit about any projects you have upcoming?
Yes. I'm currently working, and this is, it's kind of eerie and sometimes a little oppressive that I started working on a book quite some time ago, set during the dance marathons of the Great Depression. And the pivotal moment in this book is when FDR wins the Democratic nomination. And then, kind of the climax is when he's elected, and probably the most consequential election before this one. I think this one is more consequential or equal. I don't know. Anyway, so it's really eerie to be writing about that historical time now and to read FDR's words and like the speech he gave almost 100 years ago when he accepted the nomination, and he could get up and read that speech right now. First thing he says is, I know I am breaking with precedent to deliver this address on the radio, but I shall break precedent and leave it to the Republicans, who are much more skilled in this, to break promises. That's how he opened it, FDR. And then he did save us from the Great Depression and proved to be great. But that's kind of that's historical background for the book. And it's a fascinating world, this whole, and Beth, I relate so much to what you've done and the worlds that you've looked into, because the dance marathons have almost disappeared from our national consciousness because nobody documented them, because they were a blue collar phenomenon, definitely working class. The Great Depression hit and people, they had no money, but they had oceans of time, and and they might have a nickel to go sit inside all day and watch these people revolve around the floor and get involved in their life stories. So they played it like a reality show and had heroes and villains. But there's so much about this world and most people, they think, they shoot horses. And that's their only reference to this bygone world. But I really feel this kind of obligation to make it better known, kind of in the same way that I felt this obligation to have Kathy Williams' story better known. So that's currently what I'm working on.
Thank you. And we've had a few questions come in for you, Sarah. The first one, have you published a book of your rodeo photos?
Oh, well, thank you for asking. I would love the Southwest Writers Collection did an exhibit quite some time ago, but I do, and I'm working on getting them digitized, because when I was traveling around talking about the book, and and I showed a lot of my photographs, particularly in the area where I did the research, which was over in the coastal plains in like El Campo, Hempstead, Plum, Texas, Egypt, Texas, Bastrop, where the formerly enslaved people had created their settlements and stayed, and then held these, especially Juneteenth threaded, So anyway, when I was talking around there, I was overwhelmed at the number of people who came and then came later and said, and knew people in the photographs. And I was a horrible photojournalist. You know, if I took notes, if I took names, they disappeared so long ago. So I really would love a way to identify these people. And the answer is no. There is no book with my rodeo photographs, but I would like them out because they kind of it's another bygone world, you know, and the Juneteenth community affair rodeos have almost disappeared because they've been overtaken by a professional Black rodeo circuit. So no, the answer is no.
Thank you. Question from Marlene. Sarah, I read the Yokota Officers Club and wonder if you'll write any more on the military life.
I did. My last novel is called Above the East China Sea. Gosh, I wonder who asked that. I wonder if it's a military kid. If you're a military kid, you probably know this base, Kadena. It's set at Kadena Air Base on the island of Okinawa. And it has 2 points of view. Once again, you know, I wanted to, 2 stories I really wanted to tell about incredibly strong women. The contemporary story is of a military kid. I wrote about my generation of military kids in Yokota Officers Club, which was, you know, post World War II, when America was, you know, arguably the most magnanimous conqueror the world has ever known. And then this period, the current period. Oh, and yeah, in the Yokota Officers Club, I also wrote about when I was a go-go dancer in Okinawa, and so it's those 2 stories. I was a go-go dancer in Tokyo. Gotta class this up. And then Above the East China Sea, it's set 2 different points of view: a contemporary military kid and the incredible problems they have, all the military families have, and the Okinawans during World War II, particularly a group called the Princess Lily Girls, which were high school students conscripted by the Imperial Japanese Army to serve in these horrific cave hospitals. So it's that's my last book, and, you know, definitely military. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. I have another question for Beth. Did you get any pushback from Texans or people in Odessa about the way residents protected the perpetrator in the book?
No, and surprisingly, well, actually not surprisingly, no, I haven't. You know, I've one of the things that's kind of shocked me a little bit has been, you know, when I'm writing, I don't really think about readers, you know. I'm not one of those writers who has like a sort of a perfect reader in mind. I mean, for me, I mean, writing is just, you know, just frankly surviving the line and the page and the, you know, chapter, you know, I mean, I'm just really right there with it. So one of the things that's been a real shock to me since the book came out is how incredibly gratifying it's been to be getting emails from people who have read the book and who have found it moving, you know, and who have felt a kinship with these characters. So you know, and so far as it's offended anyone, they haven't shared it with me. But you know, and you know, Valentine's not an easy book in a lot of ways. You know, I actually really, you know, in spite of its, you know, difficult subject matter and a pretty clear-eyed look, you know, at my hometown in 1976. You know, I think ultimately it's a book about, you know, mercy and, you know, forgiveness and compassion and, you know, the way we find ways to be heroic to one another, you know, even when we don't think of ourselves as heroic, you know, in any possible way. So far, knock on wood, you know, the what I have heard from people has been really positive. So.
And then there was a second part of that question. Since your book gives voice to marginalized voices, I think it could be a powerful book for high school students to read, especially in Texas because of the relevancy of place. Have you had interest from high school teachers?
Um, Not me exactly. I mean, I think that kind of falls into the category and into the sort of purview of what the publishers are doing. But I think so. I think that there are some high school teachers who have expressed some interest in Valentine. So. But I mean, I would love that. I mean, I mean, I'm going to tell you, I mean, there's one of my favorite moments in Valentine is when, Corinne Shepherd is sort of looking after her, band of misfit students in her English class. And she says, stories will save your life, right? And, for me, that's absolutely true. From the first book, I remember loving dearly, which was Charlotte's Web, all through my whole life. I mean, right now, for example, I'm reading a lot of poetry. I find myself going back to poetry a lot during these really, really difficult days, so the thought that, some high schoolers would read Valentine and find it moving or see some kinship there. I mean, that's amazing. That would be a wonderful thing. Right. I mean, I guess that's kind of the dream, right? If you're a writer, that someone somewhere will be as moved by your book as you were by all the books you've ever read in your life, so yeah.
That's a great statement. Thank you. And Beth, I don't think I asked you, are you have anything upcoming that you're working on that you wanted to tell us about?
Well, I've written a lot of, the short story form is really the one I feel most comfortable with. And while I was working on Valentine, I actually wrote a couple of collections of short stories. So right now I'm working on short stories and trying to sort of round out those collections a little bit. I love this. I love the short story. I think it's like the jazz of American letters. It's just so lovely and perfect. And there's really just nothing that sort of delivers the emotional punch of like a perfectly wrought, right, short story. So right now I'm working on short stories. There was a lot of material that was cut from Valentine. In early drafts, that book spanned about 11 years. It started in 1976 and ended in 1987 in the midst of that horrific oil bust of the 80s that I know most of y'all probably remember. And at some point I plucked out about 25 pages and set everything else aside. And that 25 pages, Mary Rose's chapter and Glory's chapter became Valentine, which only, covers about 7 months right now. So I've got a lot of material I pulled out of there. And I'm kind of eyeballing the next book set in the 80s, the early 80s, when I feel like I may not be completely done with some of the characters in Valentine. So we'll see, I guess, but mostly short stories right now.
Could I make a quick comment?
Sure.
I don't know, it reassures me, Beth, to hear you talk about your struggles with writing, because that book, Valentine, reads so fluidly. It just reads like you opened a vein and let it pour on out. So thank you for that heartening comment.
Thanks.
Well, while we wait to get some more questions in from the audience, I have one. If we could just go around or did you have one, Sarah?
Well, somebody on chat.
Oh, Marlene?
No, Cheryl Leatherberry.
Oh, okay.
Sarah, would you speak about your hesitancy to write about a Black woman and how that was overcome? And thank you, Cheryl. That's the essence of why Daughter of a Daughter took 40 years to write, is that I thought that her story had come to the wrong person, and I just went through so many stages because the story wouldn't leave me alone. And I'm like the least woo-woo person you'll ever meet, but it just felt like Kathy wouldn't leave me alone. And I kind of had some confirmation of that when I was out to dinner with a friend, and she's psychic. As I say, I had no patience for that, but I was sitting with my back to the wall, and she was like, her eyes were rolling up during this dinner, and so I put my hand on her hand. I said, "Emily, what's going on?" And she said, "Oh, Sarah Bird." She always called me Sarah Bird. "Oh, Sarah Bird, there's been a woman standing behind you the entire dinner, and I know you hate this stuff, but I'm going to tell you something, and you can decide if it means something or not. And I said, sure. And she said, Emily said, I see silver doors opening up at the top of your head, and she's pouring something into it. And I don't know what that means, but I felt compelled to tell you. And I about fell off my chair because I felt like I knew exactly what it was. Kathy was tired of me waiting for her to tell her story. So, I first wrote it as a screenplay, and then, did 10 years as a screenwriter because of that, because of Kathy's gift to me of her story. But nobody ever made it. And at that point, I was told that kind of the consensus opinion was that the crossover market, which had existed for Roots, no longer existed. This was before the niche world we're in now. And so I did that for 10 years and made enough money to buy a house. And and then I put it on hold until the Meryl Streep had her contest, and I submitted that, and I was chosen. I was 65 at that time, and that gave me an opportunity to realize two things. One, I still love the story, and two, 40 years later, nobody else had told it. So, and I had to ask myself why I wasn't writing the story, and the answer was I was scared. I was scared of being criticized. I absolutely knew I'd be criticized because I had been, this kind of sounds similar to you, Beth, but I had been hearing her. I mean, she had been talking to me for almost 40 years, and I knew her voice. I was really, really connected to her voice, and so I wrote. So I had to write it in first person, double whammy as a white woman. And my editor said, "Can't you put in a white narrator, like a reporter?" She was from the South. I said, it's not a reporter's story; it's her story. So I did it, and my publisher wouldn't publish it. Said it's too political of an issue. It's too sensitive. We can't have that extra burden. And I said, well, so I had to find another publisher. It's worked out really, really well. But Beth, I also related to what she said is how alive your characters become. And I mean, I went into mourning when I was through with that book, and I still miss Kathy. I mean, it took me so long to get attached to another project because I just miss her. I just want to spend all day with her again. I want her to tell me what she's going to do next. And, but yeah, that kind of attachment. But it was, and I have been criticized. I've also been, I've had a lot of wonderful reaction. Like I spoke at, once again, photographic. I spoke at the Dallas Museum of Art, and this wonderful woman, Rosalie Reed, who has been portraying Kathy as a reenactor. She works with this group here. She took my hands and got tears in her eyes and thanked me. She said, "I've been trying to keep Kathy's story alive for many, many years, and I appreciate you bringing it to a larger audience." So that's kind of been a consolation to me through, like the Amazon reviews, which I early on was stupid enough to read, and people were saying, I could tell from the first page that she was a white woman. I said, and 19th century, able to judge whether it was 19th century or not. So yeah, it was scary and for good reasons.
I thought you did a wonderful job because the voice struck me right away.
Well, thanks, Judy. The voice was everything in that book, right? Kind of had to.
Once you get inside somebody's head, you're there, and their speech becomes yours. But I thought you did a beautiful job with it.
Yeah, and I understand the criticism. I mean, it's appropriate. We're at this time, too many stories have been appropriated by white people, and I mean, I understand that. I absolutely understand that, and that that criticism is a price for publishing this book. It was a great honor, and I'm glad I was able to do it.
I had a kind of not to the same degree because she's only one character, but Sarah, I really struggled with that when I was writing Glory Ramirez's
I
second.
was wondering about
Oh my
that.
God. Yeah, no, it was I went back and forth on that for months and
You had
hands
to.
down she was the hardest character to write, in part because she was the least familiar to me. Odessa was deeply segregated in 1976, and I really went back and forth on that, I mean, what was my motivation, what would happen, how would this book be different, if I had this happen to one of the white girls in town, what was I getting out of this? I mean, I really interrogated every choice,
Yeah.
and ultimately, I mean, for me, I landed in a couple of places. The first was I knew I couldn't write Valentine without at least attempting to grapple with the racism,
Yeah.
in my
Yeah.
hometown at that time. And the other thing was that when I started doing research for the book, going downtown when I was in Odessa and looking at old copies of the Odessa American, I realized in very short order that crimes against women and girls during oil booms were incredibly common, and as common as they are, they were even more common for women and girls of color, and so that was kind of, but yeah, and it's, I love what you said about, at some point you just make the decision to take the risk and let the chips fall where they may, right?
Yeah, I was really curious about that, like the one character that's not white. And but man, that book is impeccable. Also, I'm sorry, Judy, I would just like to thank you for your comment because nobody knows the voice of the 19th century woman like you do. So thank you for saying I got it right. You're the you're the dean of the 19th century woman.
So I had a question, and all of you can answer, but specifically for Beth, um, landscape is an added character in your book. It just like you can breathe in the dust and smell the oil. It's such a deep character in your book, and I just wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure. So I mentioned earlier that, I really do see Valentine as a love letter, to the place and to the people. I left home pretty young. I left at 18, and pretty much tumbled out into the big wide world with, no job skills and no money. And like a lot of people who leave their hometown early, I was, that was dust in the rearview mirror as far as I was concerned. And, I never imagined that I would go back there. I certainly never imagined I would write about it. But again, these women's voices kind of stuck with me. So I still have family there and I go back, as often as I'm able. And so when I started working on the book, one of the first things I would do when I went to see my sister was pack a lunch and borrow her truck and go for long, long, long drives through the oil patch. Like I'd get up and leave at like 8 o'clock in the morning and come home at like 10 o'clock that night. And as y'all know, once you get past all the oil wells, West Texas is absolutely beautiful. And the Chihuahuan Desert is jaw-droppingly beautiful. And so I spent a lot of time out there, and I spent a lot of time just jotting down notes. And again, I knew I couldn't write the book if I couldn't do it from a place of love. So for me, falling back in love with the land was the thing, and I miss it. I mean, I joke with my husband and son that like, as soon as my kid is like launched into the world, like my husband and I are going to be on some like somewhere in far West Texas, out down by, outside of Fort Davis or something, or even down by like Ruidoso, so I really love it. And it's such a singular landscape. And while you don't think about these things when you're actually writing in the early stages, I think I reached a moment where I was deep enough in drafts that I started to ask myself, like, well, what would I want a reader to take away from this? What would I want them to see? And I realized that in addition to sort of, spotlighting these women and girls' lives, that I hoped that readers would start to see West Texas as a place worth saving. you know, we don't think about West Texas, you know, we think about the coast of California when people talk about drilling. You know, we think about the Alaskan Wildlife Refuge and all of these places that are spectacularly beautiful, you know, and worth protecting. And I hope that readers, particularly readers who don't know that part of the world, would take a look at far West Texas and see that too as a place that's worth saving, that's a place worth valuing. You know, I know in recent years, for example, that a lot of the ranches in far West Texas, a lot of the old ranches have been bought up by, you know, oil and gas companies so that they can, you know, harvest the water, right, and haul that into, you know, West Texas for fracking, you know. So, you know, it's a beautiful part of the world. It wouldn't be the worst thing, you know, as we consider moving forward, you know, in our progress and the sort of, you know, gradual but important sort of move away from, you know, fossil fuels to think of that place as a place worth preserving. And I think too, again, because I've lived in cities, you know, I've really come to value I've really come to value places that are not peopled, you know, and that's one of those places, you know, I've come to value places where you can get in your car and drive for 2 hours and be alone, like truly alone, you know. And I think that's such a valuable thing, something worth preserving, honestly. So, yeah.
I'd have to jump in and say I have not read the book, but I've read the opening pages. And man, you were right there in that spot with that young girl. I mean, yes, you could taste the dust. It was so real.
So real. Could I ask Judy a question?
Of course.
So Judy, I am astonished by not just, you know, the volume of wonderful books you've produced, but how widely diverse they are. And I just want, I mean, could you talk a minute about how you have such a fluid brain that you can go from 19th century history of women to cooking mysteries to children's books to, what am I missing?
You know, it's all been kind of accidental. The first book I ever wrote, or the first novel, was published as a juvenile. I didn't know I wrote it as a juvenile, but it had a 14-year-old protagonist, and that's how it came out. And it was hard because for years I was pigeonholed as a young adult writer, and I didn't want to be. I got into the Western bit. Remember, I'm a kid from the Midwest, in graduate school, because I had a professor that I really liked. One of his specialties was the Western. And I somehow got in. He still reads everything I write. Oops, you all went mute. Anyway, the mysteries, I've been a mystery reader all my life. And I always wanted to do it. And I thought, well, if I could just get one mystery published, I'd be happy. But no, it's like, you know, you keep going. So I haven't consciously done this. I like to keep busy. I'm a storyteller.
So we're almost out of time, but before I close, one suggestion was maybe we go around the group and have you all recommend other women writers that you really like to read. You want to go first, Beth? We'll go in reverse alphabetical order.
Sure. So, I was thinking about, Sarah, about your story in the Love Letter to Texas Women about meeting Molly Ivins and being so starstruck that you wish that you could go back. And something similar happened to me in the months just before the book came out. I was going to some of the trade shows and I found myself signing advance copies of the book, sitting at a table next to Paulette Giles. I was so starstruck that I could hardly even speak to her because I admire her so much and her work is so beautiful. So I guess I'll start with her. I just got, and I have not, I've loved everything I've read, but it recently came to my attention that somehow, some way I had missed Stormy Weather. So this is the book I'm starting next, actually. So, and then I recently reread Pale Horse, Pale Rider. Speaking of strong women, the Women in Old Mortality, the opening short novel, are spectacular. And then from a kind of just very new, this is a debut novel by a woman named Kelly Jo Ford. It's called,
oh my God, I love her.
it's so good. Yeah.
I got to, when she applied for the Paisano, I was introduced to her work and, ultimately got her, I advocated strongly for her. She's fabulous.
Yeah.
Yes.
Really,
Yes, Beth. May I invite you to apply for a Paisano Award? Come back to Texas, girl.
I used to apply for them and they always told me no.
Well, they won't tell you no.
And then finally, I've got this memoir called Carrie. Tony is not a Texan, and this book is not set in Texas, but Tony was she was up at Texas Tech for some years on faculty there. And this is a memoir. It's called Carrie, a memoir of survival on stolen land. And it's about her story as an Indigenous woman. So, so those are my recommendations.
Fabulous.
Right.
Sarah, do you have any?
So I should have been prepared. Whenever anybody asks me that question, I just go, gosh, I don't think I've ever actually read a book in my whole life. I kind of, and also the other thing is I listen to audiobooks now almost constantly and absolutely don't stay in my head. I mean, I could try to, anyway, I was just looking on my bookshelf and this is not, it's kind of an obvious suggestion, but just because I can't think of anything else. Attica Locke, she's a wonderful Texas writer, writes very gripping mysteries that say an awful lot about Texas and race and being a woman in Texas. And so she's always good. And let me just think. Give me one more minute. Maybe
Okay.
Judy.
Who would you like to recommend, Judy?
Well, I read mostly mysteries these days, so it's not limited to Texas, and it sounds sort of superficial next to what some of you are reading, but the one book that always stands out as a woman's story in my mind is not Texan and not by a woman, but it's Angle of Repose by Wallace Stegner. It's a wonderful woman's story, and it just really sticks with me. Locally, I like Susan Wittig Albert's mysteries set in the hill, sort of the hill country. I read a lot of Deborah Crombie, which is England. I'm all over the place. And I'm like Sarah, they don't stick with me, a lot of them.
Sorry, go ahead, Judy.
No, I was just gonna say, audio, I'm working now, somebody is narrating the mystery I put out a couple weeks ago. I'm gonna have my first audio book and I'm so excited.
Congratulations, that's wonderful. My memory got jogged, and there actually are two books I'd really like to recommend because they were released during the time we're in now, and so they probably have not gotten the attention they deserve to get. And one, a UT Press book called All I Ever Wanted. It's a memoir by Kathy Valentine, who was the bassist for the Go-Go's, and it is, I'm kind of an aficionado of rock and roll memoirs, and this is one of my favorites. It's right up there with Carrie Brownstein, who wrote Hunger Makes Me a Modern Girl, but the writing is so good. And anyway, I really highly recommend Kathy Valentine. The other one I recommend, I wish I had my copy right here, is The Roxy Letters by Mary Pauline Lowry. And it's this loving, hilariously funny portrayal of Austin in the booming ages of fat tire bikes and Whole Foods, and just this kind of real loving look back at a bygone, not too long bygone Austin. And she's a fabulous writer, and her last book, speaking of strong women, her last book was an account of her time as a firefighter.
Wow.
So, Mary Pauline Lowry. Big kisses.
Well, this hour went by way too quickly. Gosh, I want to thank all of you so much. Thank you, Judy and Sarah and Beth, for participating in our book festival. We really appreciate it. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. And don't forget, if you want to order a book, please do so. I'm going to place the order for our books from our sources tomorrow night. So if you could get your orders in through tomorrow night, that would be great. And a percentage goes back to the library. You can order off of BoerneBookFest.com, and they come with a signed book plate signed by your favorite author. So thank you. And
Thank you.
thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you, Karen.
Okay.
It was a blast.
Okay. Take
Bye,
care.
Bye,
Okay.
Judy.
Bye-bye.
Talk again. Let's talk again soon.
You know, like in real life sometime soon. So yeah.
Martha, meet you in Martha.
Oh my God, I'm so homesick right now. I can't even tell you. I'm
You
like,
know, I relate so much to that. So, you know, I'm from New Mexico, kind of, and I was like, you know, backpacking through Europe, and I was in Leeds. It had been raining nonstop for about 10 years. And when I walked into a movie theater, they were playing, what's the Larry McMurtry novel where it's black and white? God, sorry.
Last Picture Show?
Last Picture Show, yeah. Anyway, I started crying halfway through that. It didn't stop till I was on a plane home. But I get that, man. I get that.
Judy knows this, but September and October, early October, are really the golden months in Chicago. It's absolutely beautiful here this time of year. But as I'm getting up and going for walks, long walks, you know, I told someone the other day, I feel like right now with everything that's going on, like literally the only thing I have completely mastered is the long walk. But you know, I'm feeling, you know, it's getting colder.
I'm sure, but as you
I'd
long,
like to point out,
I long for like,
Beth is wearing a bra.
I'm always a little bit homesick for Lake Michigan.
Yeah, it's I know. I mean, I love Chicago. It's a great city, you know. So yeah, I really want to toggle back and forth between the two. So anyway, hey y'all, thank you so much for inviting
Thank
me.
you, ladies.
Good to see you all.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll be in touch soon.
All
Yes,
right.
indeed.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Sarah. Bye, Judy. Thank you.
Have a good festival, Karen.
Thank you.